Fantastic. So I think it really speaks to the strength of the Turing with the diversity of talks that we've seen today, where we start of the session with a talk on AI ethics, and we move on to digital twins of patients and the heart. And so the trick that we have, just to give people context, with a kind of a cross-cutting theme. And so we think about Turing 2.0 with the three main challenges, and that there are a number of things which are kind of cutting across these different challenges, and the trick being one of them, where we have people working on health, which is myself, digital twins of the environment, as well as digital twins of infrastructure. And I think there's kind of cross-cutting themes linking across the different challenges. It's one of the strengths of Turing, again, where we're looking at making sure that we don't build in silos into the institution. So when we think about healthcare, in many ways, we're going to see a changing landscape as we move forward. We're going to see a growing aging population, which is not surprising. As people age, we're going to see a growing number of comorbidities in those patients, so we're going to have older, more complex patients. We're also going to see more options, and so we've seen with the pandemic that we had a kind of a wider adoption of telemedicine and remote healthcare, and we're also going to see a wider adoption of remote sensing, wearable technology, more engagement with iPhones or kind of app-based healthcare, and with implantable sensors. So we really want to think about how can we start to adjust our healthcare system so that we are both accommodating the new challenges we face, making use of the new technologies that are available to us, while at the same time ensuring that we're building on what was already working. So our thought process for this, as the name might suggest, is that we're going to be looking for a digital twin solution. And so what we're looking for in the digital twin is to look at how we can make a digital twin care pathway and do so within the NHS. So how can we make this, move this from an idea that we will talk about and people will these slides, such as myself, and move this to a point where we can have a patient come in, have their digital twin make, and have that digital twin make meaningful forecasts. And so this will allow us to move from not only personalized care, but also timely care. So we're not choosing just not the right therapy for the right patient, but the right timing for that therapy as well with digital twins. So obviously self-serving evidence, but my interest is in cardiac modeling, and cardiovascular care has been one of the diseases which have been recognized by the NHS long-term healthcare. It's one of the areas where the NHS could have the greatest impact on extending life in the coming period. So that really has motivated us to look at cardiac digital twins. And when we think about digital twins, we start off with where have we come from, and where we've come from is patient-specific models. And so these are where we've taken this idea where instead of just taking clinical data from a patient and using that to inform a decision, we want to take the prior information that we have about our patients. So that might be statistics describing the underlying physiology or physical laws that the patient isn't invariably going to have to adhere to. And so by interpreting the clinical data in the context of this additional information inside a physics-informed model, we can start to make predictions to inform diagnosis and therapy decisions. So this is how we can use these models for personalized care, but this is very much looking at this from the point of static data. And when we think of digital twins, we need to think how we move this into dynamic data. And so what do the models of the heart look like? What's the complexity that we're looking at here? And so our models simulate the activation of the heart, and this is what you can measure for with an ECG machine. But they link down to the cellular structures representing the movement of ions through proteins which span the cell membranes, the chemical reactions inside the cells which provide additional signaling, complexes of proteins which regulate the contraction of the muscle, tissue structure representing the preferred orientation of cells and collagen and conductivity. We can combine that with models of anatomy to look at how the heart pumps, and then models of fluid dynamics to look at how blood flow is moving out of the heart. And outlining this, what I want to show you is that from the left side and the right side, we see information about the electrics at the whole heart, which we can measure. We see information about blood flow and about the motion of the heart, which we can also measure. But these models provide a way of linking this organ scale emergent data down to the molecular scale, so we have a way of inferring some of the underlying mechanisms which are driving some of the pathologies or changes in function that we might be seeing in our patients. The challenge with this is that these simulations, while exciting and really are great from a computer science perspective, they give you a big problem to solve, are exquisitely expensive. And so we're spending for one simulation of one patient, for one heartbeat, for one estimated set of parameters, maybe 6 to 7 hours, and it's going to take on 500 cores on a national supercomputer facility. And so looking at how we might make models of thousands, tens of thousands of patients and update those models continuously through time, this becomes a computationally and energy challenging problem. And so we have these models that can now replicate many of the features that we've seen from patients. And so we can replicate the clinical data sets that we might be able to derive from patients. And once you can replicate the clinical data, that provides you with a comparator that you can compare your model against. And that allows you then to start to estimate some of the material properties for these patients to personalize the models to individuals. So how do we do that? Well, we work with our clinical collaborators. So this is Professor Aldo Rinaldi in the cath lab in the kind of a surgical space, putting a wire through someone's artery in the groin up into the ventricle to measure the pressure inside the heart. And so we can get these measurements, and my students go into the cath lab and dress up in lead suits to collect these data. So it's very much taking the computer scientist and putting them at the coalface, which is always see who faints and see who doesn't. So it's a good test. We then guess effectively our parameters for this individual patient, and we run our simulation. We then generate our results after 4,000 CPU hours. We used to compare the two together and say, are they the same, are they not? And if they're close enough, or we're desperate to kind of get a result, we accept them. And if they're too far away, we try and guess again. And we iterate around. And you can be clever in how you do your guesses, but if you're doing one massive simulation for a parameter search, it's going to take you an awful lot of simulations to try and calibrate this model to individuals. So as part of the digital twin program, we've looked at how we can accelerate this process. So part of this is how we can have improved image processing. So we can take images of a patient's heart. This might be a CT image from radiation or an MRI using magnets or what have you. We can then automate the process of segmenting this using convolutional neural networks, labeling the different regions, identifying different structures. And so we go from an image which has an awful lot of information in it to actually a reduced representation of a number of labels, but that have kind of more meaning in the form of different regions of anatomy that we can assign or kind of have prior attributes we can assign to different regions. We can then make a mesh of this, and then we can also add in microstructure, so we can look at histological data and have good estimates of what the kind of prior estimates of what the microstructure might be, characterizing the fiber orientation in a patient's heart. And we can also look at how we might accelerate this process. And so one of the things we've been looking at is, instead of running the full simulation, can we approximate it using machine learning? So can we use neural processors or Gaussian process simulators to approximate the full model, and then use those emulators as a surrogate for our full simulations to more rapidly estimate those material properties. So this is a project we've been working at as part of the TRIC, which is auto-emulate. And this was largely a process where many people have an emulation tool that they like, and we wanted to give them a library. So you can now put your model inputs and outputs into auto-emulate, and it will not only calibrate an emulator for you, it will tell you which is the best emulator for the data set that you have. So it will look at a library of emulations and solve this problem. So we're kind of reducing the barriers of entry to this type of technology. And then once we have these kind of tools for more rapidly kind of approximating the models, decreasing the cost of simulations, looking at how we can automate the process of describing the anatomy and the structure, we can then look and saying, how can we then demonstrate that we can move this to scale? So UK Biobank is just a fantastic resource that the UK government has invested in. For those who don't know, from our perspective, it's where they've got I think it's 500,000 or so people who they have taken their genetic information, recorded their clinical data, and that also for 50,000 or so of them so far, they've had cardiac MRIs performed. So this provides us with a library of cardiac MRIs we can start to build or test our approaches on, which is accessible, ethically signed off, and so is a great resource for us. So we can then look to see if we can combine images of the anatomy of the heart, so that's the MRI, along with the QRS duration, which is a measure of how long it takes the heart to activate, so a measure of function. So we have static anatomy, a measure of function, and can we use those two, much in the same way you might look at a spring and say, we know how much force has been applied in a spring, we know how much it's deformed, can we estimate stiffness? Here, we're looking at the shape of the heart, how fast it activates, can we estimate the conduction velocity or the conductivity of the heart? And we can then apply that to thousands of patients. And so instead of making models of one patient, we can do it to large numbers. And when we do make large numbers, we can start to ask questions which are more demographic. So we can say, do females who tend to have a faster activation of the heart, is that solely due to them on average having smaller hearts, or is it due to a fundamental difference in the material properties of their hearts? And this is an unknown question. However, after making models of 3,500 or so cases, if we look at the panel on the left, because I don't know if there's a laser, we found that the conduction velocity was the same in both male and female hearts, and that we could explain fully the differences in activation times with the size. And while this might seem trivial, the activation time for the heart determines who is going to get a pacemaker. It determines potentially your risk of having a rhythmogenic response to a drug, and the size of your heart is going to be useful for determining if you have heart failure or not. And so these are measurements, while seeming kind of trivial, are used daily for making informed clinical decisions and determine how male and females get treated, often the same when potentially they need to be treated differently. Once we can make large scales of simulations, we can then move away from doing studies of their physiology to saying, can we look at studies of in silico clinical trials? And so here we're looking at a pacemaker, and there are now lots of different pacemakers that the different companies have produced. And it's very hard when you have 6 different pacemaker technologies to test all of those in one patient. Patients don't like spending that amount of time in a kind of a surgical procedure. So we can now test all of these different pacemaking technologies on one heart, but we can do that multiple times, and that provides a way of kind of moving us from having in silico representations of individual patients for guiding their therapy, but to understand how new therapies might be developed and feeding that back into the design process as well as in the trial design process. But the other thing that when we think back to the start, we were talking about wearables, and when we're making these models at the moment, we're making models of people in the hospital when they're in the MRI, from data in the MRI scanner or from the surgery. And so people, though, although the way we see them, they always come in as a data set of measurements that have been made in the hospital, spend most of their lives not living in the hospital. They're out in the community, running, doing exercise, getting hot, getting cold, doing whatever. And so we really want to think about how we can better incorporate information from people in the community into our patient-specific models. So to do this, we're starting out with a patient group who are very well instrumented. These are pulmonary arterial hypertension patients, and working with Alex Rothman, who's up in Sheffield. And so they're implanting sensors inside patients' chests. They're having wearable watches to track how much their heart rate, how much they're moving. They're having phone apps to look at how they're looking at mental health questionnaires as well. So we can take this type of information and then start to look at how we can make very simple models, because wearable data, while there's lots of it, the quality is not always as high as it might be for the clinical data that we're used to. And so making simple models and looking at how we can calibrate these and dynamically track patients as they're going about their lives and seeing how those parameters might change, and as they're able to make predictions and forecast how the response to drugs, how their disease is progressing, and give us more insight into the mechanisms of their pathologies. And so this is then all moving towards kind of the overall larger vision for the DT TRIC, and that is how do we build this care pathway. So we start with our patient digital twin, which, as we've established, has simulations which might cost a large amount to build. We can get information from the hospital, we can get information from wearables, and we'd like to kind of connect all of these together so it's not just one or the other, which is one of the challenges when you have a data set from Apple. It's going to be all watches, and data from the hospital might be all MRIs, and looking at how we can link those together is one of the challenges. We'd like to make these digital twins of their hearts, taking information about population priors, as well as physiological priors and physics constraints. But we also want to make more than one patient digital twin. We're not just trying to make the exemplar, we're trying to make a service. And so this is really where we're looking at how do we reduce the marginal cost of each patient who comes in to have the twin made. And in doing that, we might have one patient here who might have an observed trajectory, which will be our digital thread, and we'll be able to make forecasts for that one patient. But if we have lots of patients, all of them with digital threads, all of them with forecasts, then we start to see that while all of us are unique and special and different, we all have many things that are the same. And so if we can make a digital tapestry which is going to link together those threads, can we share information between individuals' twins so that we can reuse simulations, we can reuse data, we can regularize information to make better forecasts and better calibrations of each individual's twins, while also reducing the costs by sharing the resources between each case. And so this is the platform that hopefully by next year we'll be having more of a presentation on. And so this slide represents how we can deliver personalized care for the individual, but I think this is really what we're going to need if we're going to scale this technology, make it resilient, make it robust, and move it into a healthcare setting. And so this is very much the vision that we have for what we'd like to see, is that we'd like to see our doctor or we'd like to see our patient with the ability to effectively play their heart like a computer game. where they can test different therapies, they can test different lifestyle choices, they can test how their heart's going to look at different ages, and that's going to give them the information they need to make the best decisions now to get the heart they want in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I'm now wondering which computer game my heart would be. I fear it's Grand Theft Auto. I just want to talk about over drinks
comment
later.
on that? No.
That's fantastic. And we've got lots of questions in, although interestingly, the questions are coming in during your talk, and some of them were then kind of sort of answered, I think, by what you were saying. So, for example, the first question that came in was, how can we plug the digital twin technology into the NHS so that it gets used at scale, if there's evidence that it offers real value? And you were starting to respond to that, if you'd like to expand on that.
Yeah, and I think the idea of the digital twin is a nice idea at the moment. And I think the challenge is to demonstrate value. And I think we have a lot of people talking about digital twins, and I really think the focus of the TRIC is very much on a minimal viable product. How do we make something that we can put into a very dedicated clinical service? So we're going to take a particular patient group with a limited number of centers and focus on making these models, updating them routinely, and putting that information in front of doctors and clinicians and patients. And once we have that kind of proof of concept, then we'll be able to understand what the costs are, what the challenges are, and what the value added is. And I think once you can demonstrate that value, then you can have a broader conversation about what it means to scale that and move that into the NHS at large.
There's a really interesting question here, which relates, I guess, to ethics, but also to practical questions. What's your approach to trials? Because it must be difficult, because it can literally be a matter of life or death. And this is obviously something that medical researchers do all the time, but is it different when what you're talking about is a digital technology?
So, I mean, we've run, there's different ways to run, there's lots of different ways to run trials. And so in no way am I saying that we would make a model and make a forecast without testing it first. And so there's a series of processes you would go through. The first would be an observational study, where you would recruit patients, have them come in, make predictions about how they're going to respond to a treatment, give them standard of care. The doctors would not have any access to the digital twin information, and then you would see how well your predictions matched what actually happened to each patient. And if that doesn't work, then you go back to the drawing boards and you iterate, and that's fine. Or at least you can benchmark and say, we are at 20% prediction, we need to be at 80% before we're going to be able to use this in a meaningful way, and that will represent an acceptable risk. So I think that it doesn't go from PhD student writing, making an algorithm to a clinical trial. There's a process, and I think that kind of observational stage, retrospective data, prospective data, and then going through a standard trial. And in that sense, it doesn't matter that it's a digital twin. It doesn't matter that it's an AI algorithm. It's the same as saying, if I take an MRI of your heart and I'm going to use that to make a decision, versus I'm going to make a digital twin of your heart and I'm going to use that to make a decision. There's a process in place, and we can follow the standard processes for evaluating that technology.
Then there's several kind of related questions that I'll try and bunch together. One of them is, how do you ensure diversity and representation for ethnicity and age in your data set? But another one was about in socioeconomic disadvantaged areas where there is a lack of wearables and harder access to healthcare, how can we make sure digital twins become more accessible to groups? So kind of related questions like, and a very, I mean, something that comes up all the time with AI and other technologies, that how do you make sure that you have good representation of different groups going in to the data and the trials, and also when it comes to implementation?
So I think for this particular study that we're looking at, there are a limited number of centres in the UK which are providing care for pulmonary arterial hypertension patients, which is a specific group that we're looking at because focus is important if you want to actually deliver impact. And Sheffield is one of the largest centres providing this care, as well as Imperial College Hospital, as well as the Brompton, I think Newcastle, and there's other centres. But there are a fixed number of centres, and so that means that it's possible for us on a UK level, in the first instance, to gain access to a wide representation of the patient groups who make up the pulmonary arterial hypertension patient community in the UK. Now, we can discuss the nuances of that decision, and I'm very happy to do so, but that kind of provides a place to start where we're making a service which will deal with the patient group that we're interested in the first instance, which is the UK population. We also have collaborated with international programs such as Go Deep, and they provide larger numbers, but of much more heterogeneous data from diverse patient population groups in America and Africa and Asia and across Europe. And so we will be able to take the methods we make from our UK cohort and test them in other potentially underrepresented groups in our cohort. But our first instance will be looking at how we can make a program which will work well for the UK population.
Fantastic, thank you. There are more excellent questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time, so you'll have to accost Stephen in the drinks reception or something, or email him your questions. So thank you very much for a fantastic last talk for today on the stage.